I'll just start by painting the picture about, what are we trying to do with the food system? And to begin with, to acknowledge what the dominant paradigm in the food system is. If we are to believe the likes of Monsanto and Cargill, and even the venerable institutions like the Food and Agricultural Organization, the thing that the world most needs is a massive increase in global food production. Some people say 50, 60, 70, even 100% increase to feed the 9 or 10 billion people that will be on the planet by 2050. There are two problems with this dominant paradigm, the way I see it. The first is that we already know that the environmental impact of food production is the single biggest impact that humans have on nature. It's the main cause of deforestation, soil erosion. It's by far the biggest user of fresh water. It's by far the biggest cause of the mass species extinction event that we are in the middle of right now. And it's the single biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, doubling food production using this current paradigm, or even increasing it by 50%, clearly puts a burden that is beyond sustainable. If we left the food system to itself and achieved a 100% energy transition to green energy, the food system by itself would take us above the greenhouse gas emissions and temperature warming agreed in Paris. So the idea that we should allow and indeed encourage the food system to continue to grow in the way that it has is it's extremely dangerous, and it is, in my view, the single biggest threat to long-term global food security. The second problem with this paradigm is that it's wrong. We don't need to double food production. We don't need a global production increase of 50% in order to provide enough food for the inhabitants of Earth. The reason why I'm confident that it's wrong is that if you look at all rich countries in the world, we already have vastly more food available to our populations than is either good for ourselves or clearly good for planet Earth. Countries like the USA have between 2 and 4 times the available calories, the needed calories to feed their population. So we have these incredible surpluses of food. It's at the root of the biggest public health disaster on Earth, that is overconsumption and obesity and diabetes and all of the problems that go with that. And of course, it's also goes hand in hand with unsustainable environmental burdens. So that's the context. Within that, we should acknowledge that there are some parts of the world where increased productivity and increased efficiency, in particular, to make more food available, is absolutely needed. In sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world where there is a deficit of food, we should be looking at productivity. But within the global perspective, the idea that we need a massive boost in productivity, production, that's my bone of contention. What we should be focusing on is reducing consumption to sustainable and healthy levels, particularly of those resource-intensive products like meat and dairy, and of course, reducing food waste. And this is where the talk today, I think, finds its place in this bigger context. When I started campaigning on food waste, goodness, about 20 years ago, next slide, please, I went delving into supermarket bins and saw this sort of thing. Now, at the time, plastic bags were actually headlines, much more so than food waste. And I said, yeah, well, what about the stuff inside the plastic? But the real problem is the combination of the two. What you have in a supermarket skip like this is perfectly good food, most of it absolutely fit for consumption, being discarded, sent off to landfill. It's all mixed up with its plastic packaging, and therefore nature does not have its normal way of recovering the nutrients in that food and upcycling them back into soil and then back into food again, or anything else. It goes into landfill and it becomes a massive environmental burden, decomposing into methane and producing all sorts of other negative environmental impacts. And the fact that every supermarket in the Western world was filling its rubbish bins with this combination of plastic packaging and food, it lent itself to a big public campaign. As I say, I started 20 years ago. Eventually, I wrote the book, Waste: Uncovering the Global Food Scandal, and that kicked off a big global debate about food waste and its role in both environmental disaster, but also as an opportunity to reduce our environmental impact and increase food production. Now, up until this point, food packaging had been seen as the big common enemy. And we've seen an increase in that, if anything, lately with the Blue Planet and the rest of it. Plastic has got a bad name, and rightly so, when it is discarded in irresponsible ways. But in the wake of my book, the plastic packaging industry saw an opportunity to rehabilitate themselves as the environmental saviors instead of being the environmental demons. And the way they did that was to position themselves as being at the forefront of the reduction in food waste. There was a huge amount of hype about food waste as a problem, and the UN, of course, got on board, and the packaging industry said, well, we can stop food waste. If we package it effectively, we can reduce the amount of waste that is produced. And indeed, some of the packaging companies put out calculations that showed that the environmental impact of their plastic packaging was in fact negative, a negative environmental impact. In other words, they were doing environmental good. And the way they did those calculations was by saying, look, if this sliced mango wasn't put into a plastic package, the mango itself would go to waste, and the environmental impact of producing mangoes is X, and the environmental impact of plastic packaging is Y. X minus Y shows that actually the world is in a better place because of this plastic packaging and its ability to save that food. Now, the flaws in those arguments are, of course, transparent to all of us. Did the sliced mango need to be flown in its sliced fresh form from Kenya to the UK? And if it hadn't done that, would it have needed that plastic packaging in the first place? But the argument was put forward that the plastic industry was of course the savior because it reduced food waste. Now, what we're up against is a very, very powerful plastics lobby, and on the other hand, serious and genuine need to reduce food waste. And this is where the packaging, the second generation packaging and third generation packaging has got its potential place in the big debate. Can we have the food saving potential of well-designed modern packaging without the negative environmental impact of plastic? Our paradigm here should be the humble orange, a piece of citrus fruit. Next slide, please. Now, a citrus fruit is born, can I have the next slide? Is born with its own native packaging, of course. This packaging is designed through millions of years of evolution to protect the fruit on the inside and keep it fresh. Now, as you can see here, it's not always successful in achieving that objective. This is 1,000 tons of citrus fruit, tangelos, being wasted in Peru. I visited Peru in 2000, I think it was 14, and found numerous egregious instances of food waste of this kind. Now, you'd think with its decent shelf life, a piece of citrus fruit would be able to get from Peru to the export countries for whom this fruit was being grown without being wasted on this scale. But these fruits were discarded because they didn't comply with the cosmetic standards of the British supermarkets that they were grown for. They had minor cosmetic defects, kind of slight skin blemishes. They were, some of them, a couple of millimeters too small, and therefore were wasted for that reason. Very similar instance with the bananas in the next slide. Again, bananas evolved with this wonderful natural packaging, and yet also being discarded on an enormous scale because they're not complying with basic cosmetic standards. So can plastic packaging solve the problem of food waste, and can it be designed in a way that doesn't create the problems that we are all familiar with conventional plastics? It sounds like a paradigm that we ought to be able to achieve. However, the biodegradable, natural based plastics have encountered many of the problems that plastic packaging does. To begin with, what is the source material of bioplastics? We've all seen that maize has been used, that palm oil has been used, and these virgin crops, these materials that require us to grow more food, have, if anything, exacerbated the problem that we were trying to solve. Instead of reducing food waste, we're actually taking food off the world market and turning it into plastic packaging. At the moment, that's happening at such a small scale that it hasn't had a huge detrimental impact. But if plastics start having the kind of burden on the food supply chain that biofuels have already had, then we have got a serious environmental burden. So any plastic material that requires virgin crops of the kind that could have otherwise been eaten is clearly going to be have so many negative outcomes that we should be striving wherever possible to use byproducts. And that's what many of the plastic packaging, renewable plastic packaging and biodegradable bioplastic packaging materials have started to look for, as we know. But even there, we have some pretty massive problems. Disposal is the single biggest one, because across Europe, even within nation states like my own, there is no clear way that we can ensure that biodegradable packaging actually goes into a waste stream that ensures that it is biodegraded in an appropriate way. When a customer opens a piece of biodegradable plastic in their home, there is no clear way that they can know that this should go into the compost rather than into landfill. And indeed, many composting facilities couldn't cope with it, even if it did go into that composting facility. And therefore, very often, it is de facto going into landfill. And if it does biodegrade there, it's creating more of a problem than it ever was going to solve. It's going to biodegrade anaerobically and produce methane. And therefore, we have both the problem of the source material and the end disposal point, without a unified system that ensures that all of the biodegradable packaging that it can be produced is actually biodegraded, that it does go back into compost, that it does go, the carbon gets back into the soil, is stored in an appropriate way. And without any of these systems in place, the idea of being able to produce what nature has produced through evolution, the natural biodegradable packaging that the whole world can understand, and ensure that that food goes back into an appropriate disposal system, is a mirage. And very often what we find is well-intentioned, tokenistic approaches to this problem, very often by companies who really want to be doing their bit, and individuals and consumers who want to be part of that change, are actually creating these isolated solutions that do not fit in with the infrastructure that we have for waste disposal, or indeed the production of the material in the first place, and that we're creating as many problems as we're solving when we approach it in this way. And of course, Europe has done its best and is doing so with initiatives like REFUCOAT to try to address this at a system level. And that's, I'm sure, what many of you are engaged with on a day-to-day basis, is how do we tackle this from a systems level? We need policy and we need infrastructure. We don't just need individual kind of pinprick, piecemeal approaches to solving the problem of both food waste on the one hand, packaging waste on the other. This is all part of one big picture. And yeah, I think I'll pause there at least and see whether anyone has any comments. I think what we should be looking for is healthy debate. There are, okay, so I'm gonna try and open my chat thing. I can see a couple of questions coming up. I think I can do that and still No, that's not where it is. There we are. Okay, so are we going to try and do it so that the person with a question actually reads it out? Is that something that we can facilitate now? Something we discussed.
Hi, Tristram. I think the easiest for now would be to just read the questions yourself from the chat.
Okay, so Anna Maria said, what is the main issue with biodegradable packaging going into regular recycling disposal? Well, depending on what the material is, it's very often, if you're talking about recycling, so there's, of course, just to distinguish, there's recycling, which is sending plastics off to be reformed into new plastics. And then there's composting, which is not recycling, it's biodegrading that bioplastic into compost, which would then end up on the soil, on the ground as a soil improver along with other organic materials. To address the first, the problem with a bioplastic going into a conventional recycling system to be reformed into new plastics is very often chemically, it is completely distinct from the plastics that you're actually trying to create and is not appropriate for that process. I'm not saying that can't be done, it probably can be, but unless you have a separate stream for that or a process that can cope with that different kind of plastic, you're just creating a contamination rather than an actual addition to the recycling materials. In terms of composting, if it gets into composting and is appropriate for the particular composting system that it's got into, that is absolutely appropriate. That is what we're trying to do when we're creating biodegradable packaging. But the problem is very often, if you have a lot of composting systems are not designed to take bioplastics and biodegrade them. They have a short composting cycle, for example, 6 months in a windrow system. That will not biodegrade a bioplastic piece of cutlery. That requires years in a completely separate system. It requires grinding, and very often composting facilities haven't got the ability to perform that level of composting. But as I mentioned at the beginning, very often these bioplastics are anyway going into landfill because there isn't clear enough system to ensure that it does get biodegraded properly. And that's really the point that I was trying to raise there. I don't know if that addresses the question you were saying. Okay, so another Maria says, we use plant cellulose, but not from plants or crops which are eaten. I think that is okay regarding biodegradable disposal, correct? Absolutely correct. Yes, of course, again, it does depend on getting that from the end user into the appropriate biodegradable disposal. And that's the other problem that needs to be addressed is, you have your end consumer, you've gone to all of this trouble to produce a biodegradable cellulosed non-food related material. Somebody ends up with it in their home. Let's say it's a bit of shrink wrap made out of plant cellulose. How do they know at this point what they should do with it? And what happens if it ends up in the home of somebody, for example, where I am, where there is no composting collection that can cope with that biodegradable material? I don't have the infrastructure here. I've got my own compost bin, but I can't put my biodegradable cellulose plastic into it. I could put it in if it's more like a cardboard material, but otherwise I'm just going to stick it into the landfill system, and there it's going to create the problems that I mentioned. I'm going to go up because I see somebody said, hi Tristram, this is Nina. You mentioned the problems of creating bioplastics from virgin sources, which is unsustainable. What about using surplus materials from the food industry that would otherwise go to waste, e.g. cheese whey? Is this more common? Okay, it's definitely not more common, but it's on the rise. People are well aware that going for secondary materials, materials that would otherwise be wasted, is a much better solution than going for virgin materials. The problem, well, there are a number of problems. sometimes people are looking at the kinds of waste that for example, what I've shown in the slides, there's bananas and oranges going to waste, and you could use that as a material for all sorts of kind of processes, packaging, or whatever. But the problem is it's got an unreliable supply, and what industrial processes usually require is a constant, reliable stream of waste that is going to be routinely available in the same form day in, day out. I'll illustrate this with my next slide, actually. I've been campaigning on food waste for many years, and I don't know if you can now see a huge skip full of bread, but it was the fact that bread was being wasted in this routine way, day after day, from sandwich manufacturers, that made me realize this was amenable for an industrial application. And what I upcycle that into is not packaging, but beer. I set up the company Toast Ale. It upcycles bread that would otherwise be wasted. We pour our profits into the charity that I founded, Feedback, and other charities trying to fix the food system. And I'm able to do that because I can reliably know where a huge quantity of bread is being wasted at all times. When we go for occasional surplus arisings, it's much more difficult to build an industrial process around them. But go to the second point, and this is one more of a systemic problem. You mentioned cheese whey. And cheese whey, for sure, you can use that as an industrial material for all sorts of things, and let's say packaging. The question is there a better use for it? If it's being actually wasted at the moment, then any use is better than that. But there is a traditional use for cheese whey, and that is as livestock feed. If what you're doing is using cheese whey that would otherwise be going for livestock feed, your question then is your use for it, making a bioplastic, better, environmentally speaking, than using it as livestock feed? And very often the answer is that we have, in fact, perversely incentivized the wrong utilization of surplus material. So there's a really clear parallel. It's become a massive issue here in the UK and many other countries where anaerobic digestion has received strong fiscal incentive in order to facilitate the removal of organic material from landfill. So in the UK, anaerobic digestion of organic material to produce energy was being financially supported in 3 different directions. And that meant there was a boom in anaerobic digestion capacity building, that it made sense suddenly for many producers of organic material like cheese whey, surplus fruits and vegetables, all sorts of organic material that used to go for livestock feed. It became economically preferable to send it to AD because of the fiscal incentives. Environmentally speaking, it is much, much better, up to 20 times better, to feed that waste material, that surplus material, to livestock, rather than sending it for AD for energy production, green energy production. And what I'd be wary of is any material that could be used higher in the food waste hierarchy. The hierarchy is feed people first, livestock second. That is what we should be doing with food that could be being consumed. There are plenty of waste materials that are not being used and not amenable for use, and cellulose byproducts from crops or whatever, depending obviously on the source, is a really good place to start. I don't know if that helps with that question. What are the main areas within bioplastics where you would like to see more research happening? Well, I think what we've just mentioned, processes that can take what is genuinely being wasted and turn it into plastics. I went to an amazing laboratory in Singapore a couple of years ago. Professor William Chen has about 7 PhD students in his laboratory, and they are all working on ways of getting waste materials into industrial processes, including there was a woman who had genetically modified yeast to turn brewers' grains into cling film. And it was an incredible process. Now, normally brewers' grains, I would rather that was going for for livestock feed. It's much better. And another PhD student in the same laboratory was using genetically modified yeast to convert brewers' grains into a more digestible form for chickens, because Singapore doesn't have any of the animals that would normally eat brewers' grains, spent brewers' grains, like pigs and cattle. They're small land mass, and they don't have that kind of livestock at the right kind of scale. They do have chickens, and so they're looking for ways of appropriately upcycling that waste material in that geographical region in the most efficient way. And I think that you know, that kind of process is very, very exciting. How can we get genuine waste materials into service, so that we don't use virgin starches that could and should arguably either be feeding people or livestock. And then the second area of, well, it's not even about research so much as policy, which is ensuring that these well-intentioned bioplastics actually have an end process that is appropriate to their, appropriate to them. Anna Maria says, thanks, Tristram. Yes, it does. I'm new to bioplastics, so learning process for me. Good. Good morning. Composting falls within the organic recycling technology. This is Chelmira. Compostable plastics biodegrade in composting facilities according to industrial composting standard EN 13432. I'm not quite sure what the point being made here. For sure, compostable plastics do biodegrade in the right composting facilities, but it's just as I mentioned, there are some composting facilities that are not amenable to, you know, I can tell you, if somebody puts a biodegradable nappy into my compost bin, it will still be there a year later. And many commercial composting facilities will say, yeah, we can't take biodegradable plastic or that kind of thing. They don't have the right composting facilities. And I'm being given my final time, I think. Have I got time for a couple to answer there's a couple more questions here, aren't there?
Sure, maybe last one.
Last one. Hi Tristram, this is Luca. Are there any already well-functioning examples globally of who deals with bioplastics waste efficiently? Not to my knowledge. Do you mean on a national level? Not to my knowledge. If anyone does know, can they tell me?
Okay.
Andrew has a lovely one, which can I end on it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Andrew says, we can stop using plastics to wrap our food. We can use virgin food or non-virgin food. The big problem to food waste and packaging use and waste is consumption. Our individual consumption levels are crazy. How do you think we can get consumers to reduce their consumption? That is absolutely the big question that we are facing. And I think that at this time, where we are all stuck at home, where all of a sudden our purchasing practices have been changed dramatically. Certainly the surveys that have been done in the UK and the US indicate that people are taking this as a time for reflection, that people are valuing food more, people are wasting food less, people are cooking from home, at home from scratch more, inevitably. They're skilling themselves up for this kind of food system and valuing this natural resource. I think this indicates that we probably all have within us a recognition of our dependence on each other, our dependence on the natural world, our appreciation of the natural world, and our desire to preserve it. And I think that awakening in all of us, in as many of us as possible globally, this connection to to the earth and to nature, to its beauty and to its fragility, is the single most powerful way in which we can change behaviors. Because it's only when we love the natural world that all of this technical stuff about biodegradable that and virgin this and composting and industrial system, blah, 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 that only makes any sense if it is rooted in a deep, genuine belief in the value of this wonderful planet that we're trying to preserve in its wonderful, beautiful form. And yeah, without that, we're just talking about meaningless numbers. So when we look at the enormous power of the industrial lobbies that are exploiting natural resources and turning natural resources into profit at the cost, to the cost of planet Earth and to the cost of the future generations of humans on this planet, they have enormous power to perpetuate that system. On the other side, I believe in our bank account, if you like. We don't have trillions of dollars to spend on lobbying and mining and deforestation, but we have within us, each and every single human being, a desire to connect with each other and connect with the earth. And that, I think, is our most powerful place to go when what we're trying to do is change behaviors. From that flows a desire to change diets, to waste less, to produce less waste in the first place, and to consume with care and with a conscience. And I know that's quite abstract, but I say it because I think that we can get very lost in technical answers, and actually remembering the root of why we're wanting to even answer these questions in the first place is a very important part of the equation. Thank you very much.